Good evening. Welcome to this very special performance. Tonight, the Sheffield Chamber players are going to perform Shostakovich's final string quartet. If you're here, it probably means that you're very courageous and that you prefer despairing beauty to the American Football Championship. So welcome for that. I'm Adam Weiner, I'm the chair of the Russian department, as many of you in this room know. And we're delighted to host the Sheffield Chamber players, possibly for the 10th time. It's maybe the 10th anniversary. We've had a long and rich relationship with the ensemble, and we're very pleased to continue it tonight. I want to say a special word of thanks to my administrator, Katie Sango-Jackson, who was just here but now stepped out the door. She's probably arranging something again. Without her help and the help of her assistants, our students, none of this would ever work out. So thank you, Katie. And now I'm going to ask you to join me in welcoming the players, and Alex Lavila will say a few words about maybe the group and particularly the program for tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for the introduction, Adam. Let's just say, introduce ourselves to you. As Adam mentioned, I'm Alex. We have Sasha on the first violin, Andy on the second, and Leo on the cello. Now that we can put faces to the names, we are Sheffield Chamber players, and it's just such a thrill to be back and to continue this collaboration, which we have been doing since 2016, I believe.
Yeah.
Pretty much consistently. And we've been bringing great repertoire by the composers of the Russian area studies. We had Ukrainian composers and Russian composers over the last, 9 years, or 10 years. We're fuzzy with the numbers, but every time it's such a treat to be back and talk about this and perform and also hear your questions. So as we're going to go through this program and as I'm going to discuss the quartet a little bit, we're going to perform it. If you have great questions, we will have an opportunity at the end to answer them, and the entire group will answer the questions. We're always looking forward to that part of our presentation. Now, the burden of introducing this work falls on me, and this year it feels like every year there's so much to choose from. This year it's particularly tough because we have just, of course, marked the 50 years since the passing of this composer. And we do have a 15-year-long pairing project between the quartets of Beethoven and Shostakovich going on, and we're in year 11 of that. But we get to choose which ones to present this year, and we made a deliberate choice of presenting Shostakovich's last quartet this year to mark the occasion. Talking about the piece, especially the occasion of the commemoration of the composer's passing, is difficult without delving a little bit into who the composer was. He composed this quartet with very, he didn't go in a lot of deliberation about what the work is about, but it is pretty clear that most of his last compositions, and especially this quartet, are somewhat autobiographical, or at the very least they provide the reflection of some kind. But what is it that he might be reflecting on? The work was written in May of 1974, a little over a year before his passing, and it was largely written while he was in a hospital yet again in Moscow. He was writing it with the left hand that was trembling because he had no use of his right hand by that time due to multiple medical concerns. It was initially thought to be poliomyelitis. Eventually, some researchers established that it probably was ALS of some kind. In any case, he persevered through composing what ended up being his longest string quartet, number 15th. And it was not until after the premiere that he finally considered that he might not be able to fulfill his goal and plan of writing all 24. When he started writing these quartets, from the very first one he had a plan of kind of imitating the the cycle that Bach has created with the preludes and fugues, going over all the major minor keys in the series of 24. And even though it was pretty clear that he will not be able to compose 9 more quartets at this kind of a condition that he was already in, he didn't admit it until the very last. Come in, welcome. One more. So when we try to discuss the subject of reflection, what might a composer like Shostakovich be looking back on, reflecting? There's quite a rich life that appears in front of us, and we have to pick and choose. It's certainly not in the scope of the presentation to go from the very beginning of his life through event by event and discuss the significance of it and how it relates to this work. But I picked 2 notable highlights of his career and his life that I believe are relevant, and I would like to visit them with your permission. One of them, I think, is extremely relevant because the composer himself talks about it a lot, including in the months immediately before writing this work. He keeps going back to the 1936 denunciation, the time when the article appeared in the Pravda magazine that just completely bashed his opera that just premiered. The article was written by Zhdanov, but it is rumored that Stalin himself might have drafted it, or at least gave the pointers to write that kind of article. The article probably wins the competition of the title that makes it redundant to read the whole thing. It's titled Model Instead of Music, and we already know what that's going to say. And I'm just going to read you the quote of what Shostakovich recalled about that article now, more than 30 years later, 1974. He said in conversation with his friend Glickman, "Now this article is not scary, but for many years it was used to scare and terrify. Stalin got what he wanted. Not only could you never argue with the article, you couldn't doubt it even for a second. Those who doubt already sin against the Stalin religion. The sinners could redeem themselves only through repentance. As you remember, after the article came out, management pleaded with me to repent and atone for my guilt, but I refused to repent. Back then my youth and my physical health helped me. Instead of atonement, I wrote the 4th Symphony." Well, the 4th Symphony that he wrote, he started writing before the article actually, and finished in the year 1936-37, did not see the light of the day for over a decade. He tabled it, he had to. It was pretty clear that at the time this would never be permitted to be played. It was too problematic. At that time, he and others were pressured to simplify his music, to fight what they called formalism and produce the kind of art that would be more in line with the Soviet ideals, with the kind of image that they wanted to present internally and to the public. But there was more to it than that, of course, because in the years of 1936, 1937, 1938, those were the peak years of the Stalin's terror. And even though for many years what we were taught about it had more to do with the purges of the party, the internal political wrestling, the purges actually took the lives of, well, the numbers are disputed, but I believe the bottom figure is close to 700,000, just within a year and a half, people executed. And those were people who were ranged from the artists to ordinary people. The 2 NKVD orders that came out covered order number 00485, I believe, let me just make sure I'm not lying about that sort of thing, covered those that had to do with the national minorities, and Order 00447 had to do with kulaks and class traitors and such. Well, the National Minorities Order meant that particularly Polish minorities were hunted down, arrested, and essentially executed, even though the families didn't learn about it for decades. They were told that they were sent to gulags without the right of correspondence, while they, in 80% of cases, were probably shot somewhere near where they lived. Forced to confess, forced to issue false confessions, forced to report on family members, on other innocent people, and just like that the lie snowballed and increased under its own weight, and driven by the necessity of the party to justify the preposterous thrust that there was a Polish conspiracy inside the country that needed to be nurtured and hunted down. The conspiracy that had to justify its own existence, and it's relevant as just an example of the massive amount of atrocity that was going on in those years, not just with Polish minorities, but also because Shostakovich himself traces his origin to his Polish grandfather, who was exiled to Siberia during the 1860s riots, and whose rebellious spirit you can certainly say Shostakovich inherited. These days we have the luxury of modern media to see the outrages and to see with our own eyes the kind of events that infuriate us and react to them. But back then people learned from this from relatives, from friends, from hearsay, but it was inescapable. It certainly touched Shostakovich personally, touched his friends. His mother-in-law was under suspicion and came that close to being executed as a part of some kind of conspiracy around this time as well. The worst was that he couldn't talk about it, not publicly, not even privately. People wouldn't dare to even whisper about such things openly in the privacy of their homes, because of course reporting was encouraged on your family members, on your friends, on your colleagues, and practiced. And it is in this environment that Shostakovich seems to undergo his major transformation into a composer that we know and kind of understand these days. He, since 1926, when he first came into the scene as a young and promising composer, his experimentation and his avant-garde approach was the subject of newspapers, of much attention abroad and domestically, but it is now in 1937 when he composes his Fifth Symphony, the one that did get performed, unlike the Fourth. It did get premiered because it did pass the very sort of high plank of acceptability by the censorship. And what he accomplished with that is, of course, his sort of quest for truth in music. The quest for truth that seems to be central to the core of his character and is remarked upon by not just himself but many others. For example, many years later, the great Russian physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov says about Shostakovich that he was able to tell the truth through music when it was impossible to tell it in words. And this kind of really does capture the essence of the Fifth, the essence of how that is radically different from everything he composed before. We don't really need much more testimony to that than just a description of what happened at the premiere. At the premiere in 1937, in November, at the height of this kind of terror that was unspeakable and impossible to speak about, the hall of the Leningrad Symphony Hall was packed. Yevgeny Mravinsky led the orchestra in the premiere of performance of this symphony. And at the end of it, it was more than just a triumph. There was not a single person that wasn't moved, according to the witnesses. And the ovation at the end of the last movement lasted for 30 minutes. Ravinsky stood up and instead of taking a bow himself, he took the score and lifted it above his head as some kind of a scripture. Everybody understood what this music was about. Nobody needed to say a word. And this was the power of the art that Shostakovich defined himself through for years to come. The ability to stay truthful to himself, but also to those around. Kind of like narrate the truth that is not just his own, but the one that is shared, and especially the one that is essential and unspeakable. I'm gonna pause talking for just a minute and play you the opening bars of the symphony. The recording is kind of scratchy, and you'll forgive me for that, because what you will hear is the recording from 1938, the premiere recording, not the premiere performance, but the first recording ever made by that same orchestra, very likely with most of the same members, and Maravinsky conducting. In the next year, he composed his very first string quartet. That quartet, according to his own words, doesn't contain anything problematic, and it's kind of like referring to springtime and such. It really does sound very different from most of his output. But what he discovered at that time is that string quartet as a genre contains endless possibilities. Possibilities as a diary of some kind, a diary where he could be a lot more intimate and honest, that also could be a medium that is more powerful than the sum of its parts. A medium that is not as subjected to the censorship that a big work like a symphony might be. And it's since that time that he starts regularly composing quartets, bringing us to the next highlight that I want to share with you before we talk about this specific quartet, and that is years later, 1960. Stalin is dead already for 7 years, and Shostakovich is pressured into joining the party so that he can become the head of the Russian division of the Composers Union. You had to be a party member. That act pushes Shostakovich on the brink of suicide. He does join the party, and a month later he composes his 8th string quartet, which is officially devoted to the victims of fascism. He wrote it in Dresden, which was bombed to smithereens, and he was there working on a movie score about Dresden. But according to testimony by friends, and according to the music itself, which contains DSCH motive, one of the first appearances of it in music. DSCH, of course, is the spelling of his name. He writes himself into the music in a manner that is unmistakably tragic. I'm gonna play you just a few bars of, again, the premiere performance of the quartet by the Beethoven String Quartet, which premiered almost all of his string quartets, and for which almost all of them were written. this motive, this is the DSCH. This is literally the 4 notes that kept repeating. This is him spelling his name over and over in the fugal manner in this kind of key and in this kind of timbre. Well, what can be said about this? It's more like a question of why this caused him such frustration. Why would the act, as annoying as it might have been to be pushed into joining the party, but why would it cause him to? Why would it bring him to the brink of a suicide? And I think that this probably hints at another tension that is prevailing through his music, and that is, of course, that despite finding the language, uniquely so, that through various devices and sarcasm and such, speaks truth, and speaks multi-layered truth through abstract genres of music, he still wasn't able to escape the dependency on the apparatus. He still ended up being the tool of the giant propaganda machine that appropriated anything and everyone and everything that came out from their hands as its own. The branding of the Soviet Party was on everything that came out of the country. It was valued and used to help excuse its existence, to help excuse its crimes, to whitewash them. And after seeing all of this firsthand, not being able to talk about it, a quality that most people of that generation share, by the way, including my grandparents, who would never talk about politics long after the Soviet Union collapsed. That's what it did to people. You just don't talk about that. And he could, and yet he was still ended up being absorbed by the system, becoming a part of it. He probably figured he could do more good than not by being at the head of the Composers Union. We will never know. We just know that he refused. He would sign any document, any manifest that brought to him without looking. He goes on record saying that his music speaks everything he wants to speak, not his words. And speaking of his music and what it speaks about, around the time and after the time of 1960, his pivot towards obsession with mortality becomes apparent. In 1962, he arranges the Dances and Songs and Dances of Death by Mussorgsky, a cycle which he was obsessed about for a very long time and finally got to orchestrate it. And Songs and Dances of Death is a very peculiar cycle where death is manifest as a character. In each one of them, it's either a knight, or it's a lover serenading a woman on the balcony, or it's a military leader. It takes a personification. And later on, when he composed his 14th symphony as a response to that, death was present very palpably in each one of the movements of that particular work, even though they're based on various poems by various authors. A composer like Shostakovich kind of gradually getting pulled towards the subject of mortality, you can't escape the assumption that some of it was his own anxiety, right? He was famously frail. He suffered from 2 heart attacks by the time he wrote this particular work. He had lung cancer, he'd broken his various extremities, and he couldn't write, he couldn't play piano anymore. But I wonder that if this particular subject has also a lot to do with his penchants for truth and for that which is essential. For someone who saw so much of it, for someone who lived through age that was defined by such a massive loss of life, what was death to him? What kind of presence was that? And how could he not write about this, if you think about this? How could he create music and anything really that does not, in some way or the other, address that which was definitive to him and to many others? And so when we get to this quartet, and at this point I would like to talk about the music of it, we are stricken with the, first of all, if you have a person in front of you, you notice that all the movements are titled. Well, that's not always the case. Very often you have just the kind of like Italian lettering for speed at which it should be played, like Andante or Allegro. This time he chose to title them either Elegy or Nocturne. There's only one movement that's titled Intermezzo which title doesn't have to do with the subject of passing one or the other. All of these other genres are in one way or the other related to death, starting with Elegy and ending with Epilogue. And all of them are slow. Each movement is marked adagio. So, right off the bat, he sets out to compose music that seems to feel, especially in the first movement, decidedly un-Western. And setting the tone thus, we are introduced not so much to the tune or to the melody, but to the atmosphere and to the mood. The mood that he sets here is mostly set with this first opening phrase, but let us play that before I say anything more about that. Let us hear what it sounds like first. Okay, you can probably tell that this work is in E flat minor from the title, but not from what you just heard. He deliberately sets it in a very opaque manner as to the tonality. I would like to speak to that just a little bit because that will be significant. What he does here is he centers the tune on the interval of the fourth. And the interval of the fourth manages to escape tonality in a very particular manner. You cannot really make a chord with it unless you go outside of it. If you would play as fifth. And again. So what we just created for you is the basis of tonality. It's a major minor chord. They have coloration. They make us feel certain things. They have life. But when you use a fourth, so when you use a fourth, you cannot stick anything inside of it. None of them create the basis for tonality. This is an interval that is as close as you can get in the system to being neutral, to being gray and free of sort of emotional impact. The fourths in this piece are going to carry us pretty far. And later in the movement, you would hear a version of this tune, but that sounds more like a distant bugle call. That's number 6. Such a beautiful. Now you're probably thinking, what am I talking about? This was very much tonal and it made you feel things. Well, that's the first time that happens in something like 6 minutes of the first movement. He is being very pointed when he introduces stuff that makes you respond. He is playing with the gray zone of where there's nothing and where there's something for the entire duration of this work. In the second movement is 12 minutes into the work, And it's the first time you hear something that's decidedly different. Now, I think let us play it first, just at the beginning of it, and I'll give you a little example. Wait. And at the end of that, you do this. This is number 27. So, you might be confused. What is this? Where is it coming from? Alright, well, this movement titled Serenade, this is obviously not the serenade part yet. But what this has to do with is the Orthodox Church tradition of the funeral bells, which is called перебор. Перебор not from drinking too much, but from taking each one thing and turning it over. In перебор, you would ring each bell in turn from highest to lowest, letting each one's ring die out. And when you get to the lowest, after that you would ring them all at the same time. This is supposed to symbolize the passing of life from the youth to the old age with the lower bells, and it's supposed to symbolize death with the ringing of all of them. I'm gonna show you an example of that, what that sounds like. This is a recording from the Rostov church. Technical difficulty. They do it 3 times, and after that there's phase 1, which is like rhythmic clanging of all the bells. It's supposed to symbolize heaven and kingdom, actually. I'm sure we're gonna get to this in this work. The bells in Russian Orthodox Church are tuned differently than the Western bells. They are tuned to have a 7th underneath the main note, creating a dissonance. If you're a little confused, how do you get to the 7th? Well, you take a 4th, and another 4th. And that's the natural ring of each of those bells that you just heard. And so when he bases so much of this work on the sequence of 4ths that very quickly take us out of any tonal range, he seems to be crossing the boundary that is set not just by Western music. It seems to be crossing into the reference points that have to do with the spiritual, and the spiritual in a way that is definitely not a part of Soviet life. We're just gonna play one more example too before we play the work, and that is the intermezzo, the beginning of the intermezzo movement. The title of intermezzo usually means taking a break, and it's usually a very relaxing sort of composition where you take a break from the drama. Here it seems to be doing quite the opposite. Thank you. And surely what you've just heard is a rapid series of fourths ascending. This presence is palpable through the work. You might jump to a conclusion that it might symbolize death to him, or might depict it, or might bring in a presence of some kind. But when composers take something simple as that and puts it all over the piece, it does tell us a certain thing, and he was certainly very keen on his Easter eggs. Well, we can't wait to play the piece for you. It's 6 movements, each one going a taka into the other without a break, and the entire composition takes about 35 minutes, and we look forward to your questions afterwards. so much, and I believe we now have a little time for question and answer. Any questions?
I have questions.
I have a silly technical question. In the notes, how does he let you know how ferociously you're supposed to attack a certain note? What does that look like?
It's a great question. So in the second movement, for example, where we have he marks us to start from 3 pianos, so very, very soft, with a crescendo to 3 fortes, with a sforzando, which is like an added emphasis. So that's where you get this sense of, it's not a bell. I mean, it comes from the bell,
reverse
It's a
bell.
but it's a
reverse
reverse, yeah. So it's
You're
got
playing
this,
back
Playing
and
the
then
tape
backwards.
backwards, yeah.
yeah.
And does the intensity of that note depend? Does it vary from composer to composer, or like do you know how to play it because you know Shostakovich?
I
as
think
well?
somewhat, yeah. I mean, Shostakovich is very precise in his notation, but I think after playing, 11 of his string quartets with this group, you have a sense of the meaning just the same way with Beethoven. They're both meticulous at notating, but they're quite different, and there's just a Shostakovich stamp that is so indelible, nobody else could have written this music. Just the way that with Beethoven as well, nobody else could have written one of the Beethoven quartets, and you just can tell that it's Shostakovich.
And it's also contextual, right? Like when you have intermezzo that is fortissimo, triple forte, but it's just you and very quiet cello, and you would have probably played it. It would have feel to play differently if all of us played at the same time, let alone in the orchestra, the same notes, same markings, but there's just like drama created by just the context of the setting, having a bunch of people on the stage not playing, and have like one person playing them most, it just makes you play differently, I would imagine.
I think so, yeah, and the registers that he chooses, I mean, he both, and part of what we've found so interesting about the pairing of Shostakovich and Beethoven is that they are both such masters of contrast. So contrast in register, contrast in dynamic, contrast of emotion, like very often one butted up against the next very directly. So, and you certainly hear that in this music with extremely high notes and then extremely low notes, and these very spare textures that then mean that when we come in, all 4 of us full force, the impact of that when there's been so much sort of quiet and stillness is it really hits you in the gut. So very, very skillful, I mean, imaginative, amazing writing.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, you guys have these like little circular, like almost stopper things at the base of and you move them up. What does that do, and what denotes? What does it do? I guess.
Yeah, these are our mutes, and they make the sound a little bit more distant sounding, like. And it's just a subtle color change, right? A subtle timbre difference, but Shostakovich likes to use that in his quartets. Yeah.
It robs the instrument of many of its upper partials, the upper harmonics of the sound, so you get a darker, more muffly, less brilliant sound.
But you also have to fight the instrument a bit more, so when he does that, and asks you to play pretty loud, that just like psychologically.
You are actually repressed, right?
Yeah.
Your instrument is repressed. Yeah.
It's like speaking through the mask during COVID, right?
Shouting
that
mask.
Yeah.
This might not be a very objective question, but I'm just curious, what do you all personally think this performance, did he wrote for his Death Note or his Redemption or any reflection thing? I'm just curious your feelings to this music.
What do you?
She asked first.
It's true. It's true.
It's more like his autobiography.
Mm.
I don't know, I want to hear more voice from people who knows more of him.
I think at the end of his life, it's like just the kind of idea of writing whatever he wanted at that point, and kind of like putting all of the real human emotion into it, you know, and not being afraid to push those boundaries like the crazy sports sounda with the 3 Fs. But I don't know about a death note. I don't know. What do you think of?
For 40 minutes about but did you mean this specific performance or this quartet in general? You asked us about this specific experience we just had now, right? If I heard you correctly. So that's a very interesting question.
Mm.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for people who do what we do, live performance, and we've played this quartet a number of times. We played it a bunch in the fall together, and it's different. It's quite different each time. I mean, we are all in slightly different places, and more important than that, in a way, is that the people gathered, are different, and we get a different energy and a different sort of feeling from who's in the room. So I think it always has different meaning, and you're drawn to different things in your colleagues' performances, and that one person will lead a phrase a different way, and it sends us down a whole different path, and that's, to me, what keeps it just endlessly interesting. To play this music, I would play this again and again and again very happily, because it's like reading a great book. You're always going to find more in it every time you play it. So, yeah.
I think I would say that throughout so much of his artistic output, he dealt with death or the threat of death, often bearing witness to the death of many others, or reflecting on threats to his personal being or his family. But at this point in his life, he's really gone inward. So I don't know that I know what he thinks about death, but I can feel the questions. Does that make sense? Like, I feel him looking inward at the meanings for him. So what the answers, I may choose different answers based on every performance, but that's the thing that for me is really interesting about this point in his life, is the look inward.
Yeah, a few years ago we brought to you guys the Quartet by Silvestro, and that was an opportunity to talk about postmodernism and how that kind of music is kind of designed not to just play in the moment, but also in your memory, in your perception afterwards. Like, literally, that was the conscious approach. And to me, there's a parallel, even though these are different time frames. Technically, he's not considered a postmodernist composer, Shostakovich is. But the kind of space he opens up in this particular piece, you know, the kind of absence of events for a very long time forces you in this meditative place where time is suspended, that it is very similar to that. And so I wonder if the part of it is just to kind of open the portal into your own self-reflection, whatever that would mean to you. In fact, it did not make it into my talk, but when he wrote this work, his friend Kabalevsky came in and he looked at this like, oh, this is great, let's add all these titles, let's add all these like descriptors to each movement because it's so evocative. And he didn't go for this. He didn't want to have like a wind over the graveyard kind of stuff added to the titles. Well, he chose the narration, and he stopped just enough to kind of direct you, but then he let, I think, all of us, performers and the audience, to follow our own path through this and have our own contact with this work. So I don't know if it makes sense.
Like, I have a feeling that's because I also create things, but for artwork, I don't create music. I realized after I published my work no longer belonged to myself at all. So I think his choice for not publishing his work is because he wants to, on this piece, finally, like, for his whole life, he finally has his own work.
Thank you for saying that. I think a lot of the time we try to get to what did the composer mean, what did the composer design here, and I think it's a very good perspective for someone who's a creator to for all of us to keep in mind. That when we hear the work, let alone create it and perform it, it's as much as ours as the persons who initially created the text. It's a very, very fair point to make, I think.
And that idea of when we try to imagine each other's realities and each other's emotional worlds in whatever way we're doing that, you have to go through the lens of your own experience, right? The only way we can imagine someone else's experience is what we know ourselves. So, that's, to me, again, what I think we all really treasure about being musicians and getting to work with a text like this, is that you're imagining into this incredible mind and spirit of Shostakovich, but you're also mining yourself for as much as you can, and then we're incredibly reliant on you guys going along for the ride with us and being willing to bring your own experience into the mix as well. And to me, that's where it really gets exciting and interesting.
Well, it was a wonderful ride. Thank you so much for the support.
Thank you.